The emergency alarm echoed through every space station and planet across the galaxy. Something terrible was happening, and everyone needed to know about it right away. On the distant world of Zalani Prime, Ambassador Veltar stood in front of the biggest gathering of alien doctors and healers the galaxy had ever seen. His lizard-like hands were shaking as he spoke into the communication device that would send his words to every corner of known space. "Our world is dying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filled with more pain than a scream. "A disease has taken hold of our planet. It spreads faster than wildfire and kills quicker than poison. 17 million of my people are already gone, and more die every hour. Our children, our elderly, our strongest warriors, none can fight this invisible enemy." The translator struggled to convert his alien language into something other species could understand, but the desperation in his voice needed no translation. Every being listening knew they were hearing a species crying out for survival. "Captain." Jake Miller was having his morning coffee at Luna Station when the message reached Earth's communication center. Jake had been dealing with alien diplomacy for 15 years, and he had never heard anything quite like this. The fear in the ambassador's voice made his coffee taste bitter. Without hesitation, he forwarded the message to the one person he knew could make things happen fast. Admiral Blake was reviewing supply reports aboard the UES Mercy when Jake's urgent transmission arrived. The Mercy wasn't just any ship, it was the flagship of Earth's newest and most powerful fleet division. Blake had earned her position by making tough decisions quickly, and this was clearly one of those moments. She read the message twice, then immediately called for an emergency meeting with her senior staff. The response from across the galaxy was swift and impressive. The Keftai, known throughout space for their incredible knowledge of biology and medicine, immediately prepared their most advanced research vessels. These ships looked like floating laboratories, filled with every piece of medical equipment imaginable. The peaceful modern civilization, whose people had dedicated their entire culture to healing, began loading their hospital ships with their most skilled doctors and healers. Even the mysterious Talinari, who rarely spoke to other species, broke their silence to offer their legendary medical technology that could supposedly cure any disease. Each alien response followed the same pattern: elegant, peaceful ships designed purely for healing, staffed by gentle beings whose only weapons were their knowledge and compassion. The galaxy watched with hope as these mercy fleets began their journey toward the dying Zalani world. Then came Earth's response, and it changed everything. 12 hours after receiving the distress call, Admiral Blake's voice rang out across every communication channel in the galaxy. Her tone was calm and professional, the voice of someone who had made a decision and would see it through no matter what. "This is Admiral Blake of the United Earth Medical Relief Command. The Terran's 6th Fleet has been deployed to Zalani space. Our estimated arrival time is 48 hours. We are coming to help." The silence that followed her announcement was deafening. Every alien species monitoring the communications had the same thought racing through their minds. The 6th Fleet, the same battle group that had smashed through enemy lines at the Siege of Proxima. The fleet that consisted of 24 massive Dreadnought warships, each one over a kilometer long and armed with enough firepower to turn entire moons into dust. These weren't medical ships. These were instruments of war, floating fortresses, designed for one purpose: to destroy anything that stood in their way. Each dreadnought carried enough armor to withstand direct hits from planet-killing weapons, and their weapon systems were the stuff of nightmares for anyone foolish enough to face them in battle. The alien medical fleets suddenly felt very small and fragile as they processed this information. Had they misunderstood humanity all along? For decades, humans had been seen as the galaxy's crude warmongers, the species that solved every problem with bigger guns and more explosions. But sending warships to a medical emergency, this was beyond anything they had imagined. Across the galaxy, Alien leaders held emergency meetings. Some wondered if this was humanity's true nature, finally showing itself, conquerors disguised as helpers. Others worried that Earth had misunderstood the situation entirely. A few began to suspect that there was something about humans that the galaxy had never truly understood. The Zilani, dying by the millions on their plague-ravaged world, didn't care what kind of ships were coming. They only knew that someone, anyone, was willing to help them in their darkest hour. Ambassador Veltar collapsed into his chair after hearing the human response, tears streaming down his scaled face. Help was coming, even if he didn't understand what form it would take. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see what humanity would do when their war fleet arrived at a world that needed doctors, not destroyers. Dr. Lisa Thompson pressed her face against the thick viewing window of the bridge as the massive human fleet dropped out of hyperspace. The stars suddenly appeared around them, no longer the streaking lines of faster-than-light travel, but steady points of light in the darkness. She had made this journey countless times before, but never to a scene quite like this one. Spread out before them was the most beautiful and heartbreaking sight she had ever witnessed. The alien medical ships hung in space like delicate glass ornaments, each one a masterpiece of elegant design. The HFY vessels looked like floating crystal palaces, their transparent hulls revealing the soft glow of research laboratories. Within, the modern hospital ships resembled giant white lotus flowers, their petals opened wide to receive the sick and injured. Even the mysterious Talonari had sent their legendary healing ships, which seemed to shimmer and change color as they moved through space. But for all their beauty, Dr. Thompson could see immediately that these graceful vessels were nowhere near large enough for the crisis waiting below. Each alien ship might treat thousands of patients, but the plague on Zilani Prime was killing millions. It was like trying to empty an ocean with a teacup. Admiral Blake called out Lieutenant Tom Rodriguez from his position at the communications console. His voice carried a note of tension that made everyone on the bridge look up. "We're getting some very angry messages from the other medical fleets out there." Admiral Blake turned from her examination of the tactical display, showing no surprise at this news. She had been expecting this reaction from the moment Earth decided to send warships instead of traditional medical vessels. On the main viewing screen, the blue and green planet of Zilani Prime hung like a jewel against the black of space. But even from this distance, they could see the dark patches where the plague had killed everything living. "Let's hear what they have to say," Blake said calmly. "Open the channel." The voice that filled the bridge was filled with such anger that it made several crew members flinch. High Healer Morkith of the Talonari spoke with the authority of someone who had spent centuries saving lives across the galaxy. "What is the meaning of this outrage? How dare you humans bring instruments of death and destruction to a humanitarian crisis? The Zilani people are dying by the millions while you arrive with your weapons of war. This is the most disgusting display of callousness I have witnessed in my 300 years of service." Captain Mike Davis stepped forward, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the aliens' fury. Davis had commanded medical missions for over 20 years, and he understood better than most how the sight of human warships might appear to species who had never seen humanity's unique approach to problem-solving. "High Healer Morkith, this is Captain Davis of the UES Hippocrates. I want to assure you that we are here for exactly the same reason you are, to provide medical assistance to the Zilani people. We have no hostile intentions whatsoever." Another voice joined the conversation, this one belonging to Velenith, the chief scientist of the HFY medical expedition. "Medical assistance with Dreadnought battleships. Captain Davis, these vessels are designed to destroy planets, not heal them. You mock the suffering of an entire species with this display." More alien voices began joining in, each one expressing the same outrage and disbelief. The graceful medical ships had formed a loose formation around the human fleet, but they kept their distance, as if afraid that the human warships might open fire at any moment. Dr. Thompson could understand their fear. The human dreadnoughts were massive, intimidating vessels that looked like they could punch through a moon if necessary. Admiral Blake listened to the growing chorus of alien complaints for several minutes, her expression never changing. Finally, she raised her hand for silence and activated the fleet-wide communication system. Her voice would now be heard, not just by her own ships, but by every vessel in the area. All ships, this is Admiral Blake. Execute medical configuration. Protocol, immediately. What happened next was something that no alien species had ever witnessed before, and it would be talked about in medical colleges across the galaxy for centuries to come. The 24 human dreadnoughts began to change before everyone's eyes. What the aliens had thought were weapon ports suddenly opened wide, revealing massive manufacturing bays filled with medical equipment. The gun turrets that looked so threatening began to rotate and extend, but instead of weapons, they deployed advanced sensor arrays and atmospheric processing units. Most amazing of all, the armored hulls of the ships began to unfold like mechanical flowers blooming in space. Section after section of hull plating moved aside, revealing gleaming white corridors, vast medical wards with thousands of beds, operating theaters that could handle hundreds of patients simultaneously, and research laboratories that made the alien medical ships look like children's toys. Each dreadnought was transforming from a weapon of war into a floating medical city, capable of treating millions of patients. Dr. Thompson watched the alien medical ships through the viewing ports and could see their crews pressed against their own windows, staring in complete shock at what they were witnessing. The beautiful alien vessels that had seemed so impressive just minutes before now looked tiny and inadequate compared to the massive medical facilities emerging from the human fleet. Admiral Blake's voice carried across space to every ship in the flotilla, human and alien alike. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the 6th Medical Fleet. Every weapon you see is actually a medical instrument. Every piece of armor protects a hospital ward. Every gun turret is a sensor array or treatment facility. She paused, watching as the alien vessels struggled to process what they were seeing. Their elegant ships were designed by species who saw medicine and warfare as completely separate concepts. Humans, it seemed, had never made that distinction. We didn't bring warships to this crisis, Admiral Blake continued, her voice carrying a note of pride. We brought mobile medical cities. Now, shall we get to work saving lives? Dr. Rebecca Wilson rubbed her tired eyes and took another sip of her cold coffee. She had been working without sleep for 36 hours straight. But somehow her hands were still rock steady as she moved between the dozens of holographic displays floating around her. The main treatment center of the UES Hippocrates had been transformed into something that looked more like a war room than a medical facility, with streams of data flowing across every surface and the constant hum of computers processing millions of calculations every second. The largest display in the center of the room showed Zelani Prime in horrifying detail. Red dots spread across the planet's surface like a deadly rash, each one representing thousands of infected areas. The plague was moving faster than anyone had imagined possible, jumping from city to city and continent to continent with terrifying speed. Already, a quarter of the planet's population was gone, and the red zones were growing larger by the hour. Dr. Wilson, I need a status report. Admiral Blake's voice cut through the controlled chaos as she entered the treatment center. Even after commanding the fleet's transformation and deployment, she looked as sharp and focused as ever. That was the thing about Admiral Blake that Wilson admired most. No matter how impossible the situation looked, she never seemed to doubt that they would find a way through it. Wilson turned away from her displays for the first time in hours, her voice hoarse from constant communication with teams across the fleet. Admiral, we've managed to deploy 60 orbital treatment platforms around the planet. Each one is working at maximum capacity, and we've established treatment zones in every major population center that's still functional. She gestured to a display showing the massive production facilities that had emerged from what the aliens thought were weapon bays. The fabrication systems are running continuously. We're producing 12 million doses of broad-spectrum antiviral medication every hour, and that number is climbing as we bring more production lines online. The atmospheric processors have started cleansing the air in the major cities, filtering out airborne particles of the plague. Captain Davis appeared at Admiral Blake's shoulder, pulling up his own tactical display that showed the positions of all the ships in the area. "Admiral, the alien medical fleets are well. They are amazed. High Healer Morkith contacted me an hour ago to admit that he's never seen anything like our approach to medicine. The Keftai scientist Velenith has been studying our methods, and he told his team that humans practice warfare against disease." He meant it as a compliment. Admiral Blake allowed herself a small smile. "That's exactly what this is, Captain. While the other species focus on treating individual patients and managing symptoms, we're hunting down the source of this plague like it's an enemy army. We're going to find it, surround it, and destroy it completely." Lieutenant James Parker looked up from his position at the sensor station, his young face creased with concern. "Admiral, Dr. Wilson, you both need to see this immediately. The computer modeling division just finished their complete analysis of the plague organism, and the results are ... disturbing." The main display shifted to show a three-dimensional model of the plague virus, rotating slowly to reveal its complex structure. Wilson moved closer, her medical training immediately recognizing patterns that made her blood run cold. She studied the protein chains, the transmission methods, the way the disease targeted specific genetic markers. "This can't be right," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she knew the computers had made no mistake. The protein folding is too perfect. The transmission vectors are too efficient. The selective targeting is too precise. This level of biological engineering is impossible in nature. Admiral Blake studied the display, her expression growing darker with each passing second. "Doctor, are you telling me this plague was created artificially?" Wilson nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone engineered this disease, Admiral. They designed it specifically to kill the Zilani people. This isn't a natural plague. It's a bioweapon of the most sophisticated kind I've ever seen." Captain Davis stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "A bioweapon used against a peaceful species that has no military, no defenses, and no enemies. What kind of monsters would do something like this?" Wilson was already moving before Admiral Blake could respond, her medical instincts overriding her horror at the discovery. "If this disease is artificial, then we can break its programming. Admiral, I need access to every analysis computer on every ship in the fleet. We're going to tear this thing apart at the molecular level and find its weaknesses." She began pulling up new displays, her fingers flying over the controls as she started coordinating with research teams across the entire human fleet. Artificial diseases have artificial weaknesses built into them. The creators always include some kind of kill switch or vulnerability, either by accident or by design, if we can find it. Lieutenant Parker looked up from his console, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Admiral, when we figure out who created this weapon and used it against innocent people, what do we do then?" Admiral Blake's smile was colder than the space between stars. "Then, Lieutenant, we remind them why humanity doesn't just practice medicine. We show them what happens when you weaponize suffering against the innocent." She turned to look out at the dying planet below, her voice carrying the promise of justice. "We weaponize compassion itself, and we make sure this never happens again." Colonel Robert Hayes crouched in the darkened command center of the UES Caduceus, watching the sensor displays with the patience of a hunter who had spent his entire career tracking dangerous prey. The Caduceus was unlike any other ship in the human fleet. It was built for stealth and reconnaissance, designed to slip through space undetected while gathering information that could save or doom entire worlds. For 3 days, Hayes and his team had been conducting careful sweeps of the outer edges of the Zilani system searching for something that didn't belong. The other alien medical fleets had focused all their attention on the dying planet below. But Hayes had learned long ago that sometimes the most important answers were found in the places nobody thought to look. His persistence had finally paid off in the most terrible way possible. "Admiral Blake, this is Colonel Hayes." He spoke quietly into his encrypted communicator, his voice carrying the weight of a discovery that would change everything. "We found them. We know who did this." On the main screen of his ship, a faint outline flickered in and out of visibility near the edge of the system. It was a massive space station, heavily cloaked and nearly invisible to standard sensors. But Hayes and his team weren't using standard sensors. They were using military-grade detection equipment that could spot a hidden enemy base from halfway across a solar system. "It's a Skarn Empire harvesting operation," Admiral Hayes continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They've been sitting out here for months, watching the Zilani die. But they're not just watching, they're collecting survivors. The infected ones who are still strong enough to work. They've been taking them as slaves while leaving the weak ones to die on the planet below." The implications hit Admiral Blake like a physical blow. The Skarn Empire was known throughout the galaxy as a ruthless civilization that viewed other species as nothing more than resources to be harvested. They had perfected the art of conquering worlds without firing a shot, using biological weapons and economic manipulation to weaken their targets before moving in to claim the survivors. Back in the medical bay of the Hippocrates, Dr. Rebecca Wilson looked up from her research displays, her face pale with understanding. "Colonel Hayes, that matches everything we've discovered about the plague's biological structure. The disease isn't designed to kill everyone. It's programmed to go dormant in individuals who have specific genetic markers. Those markers probably indicate people who would be most useful for heavy manual labor." The pieces of the horrific puzzle were falling into place. The Skarn had engineered a plague that would kill the weak, the elderly, the sick, and the very young, while leaving behind only the strongest adults who could work in their mines and factories. It was genocide disguised as disease. Slavery disguised as mercy. Admiral Blake studied the tactical display showing the positions of all the ships in the area. The beautiful alien medical vessels hung in space like sitting ducks, completely focused on their humanitarian mission. Their elegant designs had no weapons, no shields, no way to defend themselves if attacked. The hidden Skarn base was positioned perfectly to strike at them if they discovered the truth. "Captain Davis, begin immediate fleet realignment," Blake ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision that would determine the fate of an entire species. "Switch all ships from medical configuration to combat configuration. Prepare for battle." Across the human fleet, the massive dreadnoughts began their second transformation. The medical facilities that had amazed the alien observers started folding back into the ship's hulls, replaced by weapon systems, shield generators, and targeting arrays. The ships that had looked like floating hospitals were revealing their true nature as instruments of war. Admiral Blake called out Captain Nancy Foster from her position aboard the UES Panacea, one of the fleet's most advanced medical vessels. "The alien medical ships are detecting our power redistribution. They're asking for an explanation. High Healer Morkith is demanding to know why we're powering up weapon systems." Blake didn't hesitate in her response. "Tell them the truth, Captain. We've found the source of the plague that's killing the Zilani people, and we're going to cut it out like a surgeon removes a cancer. Some operations require more than gentle hands. They require sharp instruments." Dr. Wilson looked up from her research console, concern written across her tired features. "Admiral, I need at least 6 more hours to complete and perfect the cure. The biological programming is incredibly complex, and if we rush the process, we might create something that makes the situation worse instead of better." Blake turned to face the doctor directly. "Rebecca, how many Zilani people will die in the next 6 hours if we do nothing?" Wilson's fingers moved quickly across her calculator as she ran the numbers based on the plague's current spread rate. Her face went even paler as she saw the result. Approximately 40,000 people, Admiral, maybe more if the infection rate continues to accelerate. Blake nodded grimly and turned back to the tactical display showing Colonel Hayes' position near the hidden Skarn base. "Colonel, can you give Dr. Wilson the 6 hours she needs to save those lives?" Hayes smiled with the confidence of a soldier who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of mission. "Ma'am, I can give her 6 hours, 6 days, or 6 weeks, if necessary. My team knows how to keep monsters busy while the doctors work." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a personal edge that everyone on the communication channel could hear. "But Admiral, when Dr. Wilson finishes that cure, I want your permission to deliver it personally to whoever created this nightmare. I want to look them in the eye when they realize their evil plan has failed." Admiral Blake's smile was as cold and sharp as a blade. "Permission granted, Colonel. All ships, prepare for combat operations. We have 2 missions ahead of us: cure a disease and destroy the monsters who created it. We're going to complete both missions successfully." She looked out at the dying planet below, then at the hidden enemy base that had caused so much suffering. "We're going to remind the galaxy why humanity doesn't just heal, we protect those who can't protect themselves." The final battle was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. It wasn't fought on a single battlefield, with clear lines between enemies and allies. Instead, it raged across 3 different fronts at the same time, each one just as critical as the others for the survival of an entire species. Deep inside the research laboratories of the human medical fleet, Dr. Rebecca Wilson and her exhausted team worked with desperate urgency. Their hands moved across holographic displays and control panels as they made the final adjustments to the cure they had been developing. Every few minutes, the entire ship would shake violently as Skarn weapons found their target, causing equipment to spark and lights to flicker. But Wilson never stopped working, never even looked up from her calculations. Meanwhile, in the vast emptiness of space around Zelani Prime, Captain Davis orchestrated the most complex defensive operation of his career. The human Dreadnoughts had formed a protective shell around the graceful alien medical ships, using their massive hulls and powerful shields to absorb the devastating firepower of the Skarn attack fleet. It was like watching elephants protect a flock of butterflies, with the heavy human warships taking hit after hit to keep the delicate alien vessels safe. Down on the surface of the dying planet, Colonel Hayes led teams of specially trained medical soldiers through cities filled with the sick and dying. They moved like elite commandos, but instead of carrying weapons, they carried medical supplies and cure dispensers. Every street corner could hide Skarn agents. Every building might contain traps, but Hayes and his people pushed forward because they knew that millions of lives depended on their success. "Cure synthesis complete." Dr. Wilson's voice rang out across the communication channels, just as another massive explosion rocked the Hippocrates. Sparks showered down from damaged ceiling panels, but Wilson was already moving to the next phase of her work, beginning mass production immediately. "We'll have enough doses for the entire planet within 2 hours." Admiral Blake stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the tactical displays as Skarn destroyer ships clashed with her fleet. The alien medical vessels hung in space behind the human defensive line, their beautiful forms untouched by the violence raging around them. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her ships that had been built to heal and save lives were now fighting desperately to protect other healers. Admiral Blake, Lieutenant Rodriguez called out from his communications station, his voice barely audible over the sound of weapons fire and damage reports. "The Kethtai hospital ship Harmony is requesting permission to help distribute the cure. Their captain says he finally understands why humans build their medical ships like flying fortresses." Blake allowed herself a small smile despite the chaos surrounding them. "Permission granted, Lieutenant." Tell them to stay close behind our screening ships and follow Colonel Hayes' distribution plan exactly. The battle reached its most dangerous point when Hayes and his teams finally reached the major population centers on Zalani Prime. The cure worked exactly as Dr. Wilson had promised within minutes of receiving the treatment. Dying patients began to recover, their bodies finally able to fight off the artificial plague. But the Skarn commander had been watching and waiting for this moment. In a final act of pure evil, the enemy ships launched their most devastating attack. Instead of targeting the human warships, or even the alien medical vessels, they aimed their weapons at the planet's atmospheric processing stations. If they couldn't have the Zalani as slaves, they would make sure no one could save them. Even a completely cured population would die if they had no air to breathe. It was Captain Nancy Foster who saved the day. From the bridge of the UES Panacea, she made a split-second decision that would be studied in military academies for centuries to come. She redirected her ship's own atmospheric processors to maintain the planet's air supply, while simultaneously engaging 3 massive Skarn heavy cruisers in direct combat. "This is Captain Foster of the Panacea." Her voice crackled over the communication system as her ship took devastating hits from enemy fire. Hull breaches appeared along her vessel's sides, but the atmospheric processors continued running at full power. Atmospheric integrity maintained across all major population centers. Medical mission continues as planned. The final Skarn ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its wreckage drifting slowly toward the planet below. The Hippocrates hung in space above the now healing world, its hull scarred and blackened from battle, but still intact. Admiral Blake stood beside Dr. Wilson on the bridge, both women exhausted but victorious as they watched the cure spread across Zalani Prime like ripples in a pond. "Final count, Doctor?" Blake asked quietly. Wilson checked her displays one last time, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. 17 million people saved, Admiral. The Zalani species will not only survive, they'll recover completely within 6 months. High Healer Morkith's voice filled the bridge, and for the first time since the crisis began, he sounded humble rather than outraged. "Admiral Blake, my people and I owe you a profound apology. When we saw your warships arrive, we thought we'd understood what humanity represented. We were completely wrong." Blake held up her hand gently, cutting off his words before he could continue. "High Healer, you expected doctors when you called for help, and that's exactly what you got. You just didn't understand that sometimes, when you want to preserve life, you have to be willing to fight for it. Every human healer is also a warrior, because we refuse to let death and suffering win without putting up the strongest fight possible." She looked out through the bridge windows at the stars beyond, where other human medical ships were already beginning their journey to whatever crisis awaited them next. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, another world might be calling for help, another species might be facing extinction. "We don't just practice medicine the way other species do," Blake continued, her voice carrying the weight of humanity's unique philosophy. "We weaponize compassion itself. We turn healing into warfare against everything that threatens innocent life." Captain Davis approached with a communication pad in his hand, a small smile on his battle-weary face. "Admiral, we're receiving a message from Earth Medical Command. They're asking for our next assignment." Blake straightened in her command chair, already mentally preparing for whatever challenge lay ahead. "Tell them, we're ready, Captain. This galaxy is enormous, and somewhere out there, someone needs a doctor." She paused for a moment, watching the blue-green world of Zalani Prime as it began its journey back to health and prosperity. "Someone always does,"